You know, malware has come a long way since the day of the stoned virus. That thing ran on a 5.25-inch floppy disk. I had a copy of it somewhere. But has it really changed? The original worm was in 98. Today we talk about what a worm is, how worms work, and how they spread on Secure Digital Life.
This is a Security Weekly production.
Welcome to Secure Digital Life. .1, 99.2, 99.3, he's making the gangland symbol for 100, which is also a really nasty word in American Sign Language. Animal plasma.
Oh.
Yummy. Boy, I bet that's a fun place to work. He'll be on head cleaning duty or something like that.
Headcleaningduty.com.
Have to wipe the drool off his frozen head once a day or something like that. Or chip it. I don't know.
I heard you were watching some inappropriate content last night. Yeah. Meet you out in the quad at noon.
That's right.
So. Anyway.
Accredited by Microsoft, Cisco, NetApp, IDLE, Oracle, and EC Council, QuickStart delivers high-impact, low-cost IT training through its cognitive learning platform in multiple domains. With QuickStart, you get an ever-growing catalog of courses, self-paced courses offered through a monthly subscription, virtual classrooms offered through an annual subscription, peer-to-peer learning, mentoring, official courses, certified instructors, hands-on labs, and more. For more information, visit www.quickstart.com. Use coupon code PAUL20 to get 20% off on all cybersecurity courses. QuickStart, creating world-class technologists. Considering a career in IT but not sure where to start? Start for free with IT Pro TV. Access more than 65 hours of IT training for free, no credit card required, with a free membership. When you're ready for more, explore the full IT Pro TV library, including training for CompTIA, Cisco, Microsoft, Apple, and more. Learn IT, pass your certs, and get a great job. Start your free IT Pro TV membership today. Visit www.securedigitallife.com/ITProTV. Pro tip. In corporate settings, don't confuse Ron Jeremy with Ron Burgundy, asking for a friend. But you and only you should register for our upcoming webcast with Observe IT, or is it Observe It? I don't know. Russ, is it? Either or. And it's Observe It and Kaseya by going to securityweekly.com/webcast. If you have missed any of our previously recorded webcasts, you can find our on-demand library at securityweekly.com/on-demand. And some of you told us that you are overwhelmed by the amount of content we distribute. In an attempt to make it a little easier for you to find what you're interested in, we created our new listener interest list. Sign up for that list and select your interests by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe and clicking the button to join the list. You can also now submit your suggestions for guests in our recently released guest suggestion forum. Go to securityweekly.com/guests and enter your suggestions, and possibly we'll take them. Who knows? So in 1988, Robert Morris, hence the name, wrote a kind of joke, according to him, piece of software that was pretty common at the time. People wrote a lot of joke software back in the 80s. When I was a sysop, we saw this stuff constantly. It was just a steady stream of people playing pranks on each other and everything else. Most of the users on the systems were engineers, computer scientists. There weren't a lot of end users, a term that became derogatory and I guess remains so today. But at the end of the day, it was, according to Morris, a joke. Now, he says he never had any intention of causing problems. He maintained that all through his trial, subsequent conviction, and so forth. But in 1988, there really were less than around estimates, 50,000 machines on the interweb. You think about that. It sounds like kind of a lot, but in the same way, it's not really very many at all. And in 1988, there were no MMORPG games, so you didn't have people playing Overwatch and all those kind of things. There were no end users at all. most everybody was an engineer, a computer scientist using a university machine. There were some newbie types that were taking, Computer Science 1 for the first time who got pranks played on them. But it was mostly just mainframe computers. Most of them were running some kind of Unix type thing, or they could have been running DEC-based stuff or whatever. But I mean, it was really just not like it is today. And there were some, and I know there was some access to this stuff via CompuServe. Ooh, I could talk about old stuff all day. Sierra Online, it was the first online service I got banned from for cheating at a game. I don't call it cheating. I called it taking advantage of the situation. But hey, whatever. You get barred from stuff because I got bored playing the game and decided to actually play it for real. But mostly it was all sysop type people. So sysop type people were sitting there and they saw something funny happening, and they usually either, I wrote my own attacks that attacked people who were causing problems, and it was like, okay, you think you're good? Well, here comes something after you. In 1988, though, all of a sudden the idea of security arose to some degree because people started seeing things like what is now called the Morris worm. But people were not really worried about security even in 1988 because theoretically no one could access these systems. Common misconception in 1988. A lot of grief that you got when you suggested that people could access systems by dialing into them, war dialing, all these kind of old-fashioned things. That B, only weird nerds could access. This is all stuff I was told at different corporate board meetings. Only weird nerds could access the system, and there aren't that many of people like you, right, Doug, around? And I was like, well, I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe I should get a pay raise. And honestly, in 1988, the most common reaction I got to talking about security was, who cares? I'll let the nerds deal with it. The nerds are the ones causing the problems, and the nerds can deal with it. As a matter of fact, the Revenge of the Nerds movie came out in 1984. Something where nerds were still portrayed as horrific losers who might be able to write a Devo cover song. But, that all changed. Now, in 1986, I did a pen test. And I didn't call it a pen test. I had no idea what to call it. But we decided to test this bank. It's all legit. That's why I'm calling it a pen test. And I wrote a proposal, and that we would test this system and see if it was subject to these kind of security flaws. And of course it was. And I almost got fired because the bank officers went, how dare you document these kind of weaknesses? This is really, really a problem. So Morris was really a big moment. And there were worms before that. I'm sorry, people. There were worms hypothesized in the 50s. There was science fiction literature in the 70s and 50s, and I think even some in the 30s where people talked about this kind of stuff. But Morris's worm was this sort of thing that really just sort of hammered in this nail in the coffin of old school network design, because all of a sudden there was something that actually caused real damage that spread and so forth. So first we just talk a little bit about how this thing actually worked. So basically what Morris did, I think he was a student at the time. Morris sat down and he wrote a piece of software that used some old services. So there's 3 old services that were really, really, really problematic. RSH, RLogin, and RExec. And all of these R-based services were ways for engineers to log into mainframe computers that were running Unix without credentials for the most part. So the original R services, especially RLogin, were designed because the idea was that who would have access to the system anyway, who would be using the system except an engineer, and why would anyone even know what any of this stuff meant in the first place? So you had RLogins persist way on up into the 90s. You saw systems getting hacked by people using RLogin. Now, I wouldn't call it a hack, because all somebody did was take advantage of the system. But a lot of early hacks were based on this very kind of thing. So what he did was he ran a piece of software that used a brute force password cracker. It was actually a dictionary cracker for the most part, and you can actually go on the internet and get the list of all the words that he had in his list, if there were any credentials at all. And there may not have been. So basically what happened was this worm went out looking for vulnerable systems that had these services running. If they had credentials, it used a brute force password cracker with a very simple password list, and it used that to get into the system as root. Now remember, R services, all right? Why is there an R on the R services? we might ask ourselves, and honestly, I don't really know, but I think it stands for root. Yeah. So our login lets you log in as root with no credentials. That was the original idea of it. And of course, back to A, B, and C, which was that only weird nerds would know any of this stuff anyway. Obviously, as that progressed, things got very, very problematic. There was a very basic Heinlein, who was a writer, conception that engineers were so all important that engineers should never be hampered in their jobs. So you don't want to delay the engineers solving the problem when the problem arises. So basically, we end up with this kind of thing going on in the late 80s. The worm was written in C, and it took advantage of these Unix things, including cracking and guessing passwords. So the first thing this worm did to actually make it a worm, so the initial sort of idea of it was just something that everybody had done at some point in time. But the first thing that the worm really did once it got in was it went and looked at 2 files. One of those files was called the hosts file. And the hosts file on these systems contained, you guessed it, hosts. And it had lists of trusted hosts on the system. Our host file is very similar kind of thing. These were all trusted computers and these files were well known where they were. There's still a file in your system today if you're using Linux, Unix, that is called the host file. It's in the etc directory. And it contains lists of hosts. So the worm went in, looked at these hosts that you had trusted, and then it went after them as well. Well, guess what? They were probably running these same services. They probably had, if they had passwords, they probably had the same lame passwords in them. And all of a sudden, the Morris worm took off. Now, if it had a kill switch. And if you don't know what a kill switch is, a kill switch in a piece of malware is typically a way for the owner to stop the malware from spreading. And why people do this, I don't really know. I mean, if you're writing malware, maybe you don't want it to infect you. Maybe you want a way to stop it if you think it's going to take you out. Other people have said it was a way to keep it from spreading to certain sites, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we talk about some more sophisticated malware. Morris theoretically didn't want it to spread to more complex systems, so he had built this kill switch into this. But unfortunately, it didn't work, and it did infect a whole bunch of machines that were on this fledgling interweb. Morris got arrested under the Computer Fraud Act. He was sentenced to 400 hours of community service, and he got a $10,000 fine plus the cost of supervising him during his community service or something like that. And he got like 10 years probation. Well, anyway, so where did the term worm come from? There's all kinds of information about this. I always thought it came from the worm Scatha in the Lord of the Rings, but I don't know that that's where it came from. So I've heard people give credit to Tolkien. I've heard people give credit to different old science fiction books, science fiction short stories that talked about stuff like this back into the 70s. I'm going to stick with Tolkien because it's Unix, it's nerds, it's computers, it's engineers. Come on. How many people have servers named Gandalf in 1988? Seriously. I know today it's all like, Game of Thrones and stuff, but back then it was all, all your servers were named after hobbits or whatever. There were a lot of things written like this before. I saw stuff like this on systems I administered even back into the early 80s. I saw students writing things that were designed to attack other accounts. One of the first worms I ever ran into on the university system back when I was an undergraduate student, I saw this worm, and it basically looked at a file in a system that had the names of other users you had interacted with stored in it, and then it went and attacked those users. And again, it was trying to break the passwords, trying to guess the passwords with a little simple dictionary attack, and it did do some of that. It was very easy to stop because it was localized, but it did actually run, and it caused a bunch of problems for people that were trying to chat online. Do we believe that Morris really didn't know what was going to happen? Today, it's very difficult, I think, for people to say, oh, this guy didn't know. He released this worm. How could he have not known that this was going to affect? But I will tell you from personal experience, in 1980s, the idea that all these systems were becoming interconnected, that something could spread beyond the local environment was very foreign to a lot of us. We were all used to dealing with machines that connected, but they were very controlled, planned, and only on occasion connections. You just didn't see this kind of mesh that we start to approach today. So do I believe him? I know that's what he had to say in court. I don't know what his real intention was, and he's not going to say because they don't want that. He certainly doesn't want people claiming more financial damages than they already claim. There was all kinds of claims of how much financial damage this caused. How much was it really? Well, in 1988, it was very difficult to measure such things, really. But anyway, so our definition of a worm then. Our definition of a worm is a computer program that somehow can propagate itself from machine to machine to machine. So it's not spread necessarily by humans, although we'd certainly call certain types of phishing attacks to be a type of worm that's utilizing humans as the vector. But real worms actually use some kind of piece of code to spread themselves to other systems automatically. That's the very nature of these types of worms. Now, most worms in and of themselves are harmless. They don't necessarily actually do anything. They are often used as vectors to convey other pieces of malware onto the system. So the worm itself doesn't do anything other than compromise a computer and then try to spread to other computers. But it's what it's carrying along with it, the parasitic malware that it's carrying on its back, that it's going to inject the system with, that makes it such a damaging thing. So a lot of worms themselves don't actually cause anything. There are harmless worms that have caused resource loss. We've seen that. Some of these early worms, and even some worms today, start to create denial of service type attacks because the simple fact that they're spreading all over the place and they're not bouncing around. It's kind of like Morris's kill switch that didn't work. This kill switch meant that the machines could have checked to see if the machine was already infected, but it didn't. So the Morris worm continues to try to spread to the machines that are already infected with the worm. And this kind of like bubbling, seething mass of maggot worms is kind of, a real problem. We were talking about eating spaghetti during cannibal movies earlier, and so I'll leave you with that image a little bit for that. But the payload is where the real harm comes from. So even on modern worms, the worm themselves, you look at the code for them, you deconstruct that. Those modern worms don't really actually do much. It's really something else. Other things that were like worms, but they really weren't worms, were things like the ping of death. So back in the old days, there was an attack called the ping of death in the 90s. The ping of death attack basically was a malformed ping packet, and that malformed ping packet crashed network equipment. It wasn't a worm, but it spread kind of like a worm. So somebody had written we all thought it was a worm when it first started spreading, but then it turned out that it really wasn't. So a ping of death was not really a worm. I had somebody ask me that not too long ago, and I was like, no, it really isn't. But it did have a lot of semblance of that. So what you really need to write a worm, here in Toolkit 101, is some sort of compromise. I don't know what the compromise is. So it could be a 0-day. It could be just simply breaking a password on an R login. It really needs a way to escalate if it's going to inject anything onto the machine and or propagate. So it almost has to find a way to get to an executable level. It doesn't have to be root or administrator or whatever you want to call it, but it definitely needs to get in there. Now, back in the 80s, we also did not have very much of what is called network segmentation today. And these flat networks in the early 80s that persisted on up into the 2000s used hubs. And so that meant that a broadcast reached every machine in the network. You didn't even need to look at the host file if you could simply send one single broadcast packet to every machine in an entire university or an entire enterprise. And we saw people doing just that. As you can guess, if you sent traffic to port 23, you could do a port scan. There was a broadcast. You see where you get replies from on port 23. And every time you send a send packet out, it would be seen by every machine in the network. And I saw a lot of those kind of flood attacks early on. So if you were writing a worm that did telnet, if your worm sent a broadcast of send packets to port 23 that was just sent all the way across everything in the enterprise, and then those send replies, so the SYNACs come back. When you get that SYNAC packet back, you go, here's all the IP addresses that actually have port 23 open. And then you could immediately start trying to brute force telnet. And as we all know, telnet at the time allowed you to send as many, piece of traffic or whatever. But, that's just one way that you could have written some kind of a compromised worm back then. Morris just, basically looked up his hosts and then talked to them using these same tactics and assumed that everybody would have the same type of operating system, which at the time was pretty much true. Today, it's a lot easier in some ways to learn about the network. Server messaging block. If we look at server messaging block, Windows machines immediately start talking the minute you turn them on. They announce themselves. They send out broadcast advertisements to other machines saying, hi, I'm a Windows machine. Why don't you come talk to me and let's exchange information? Server messaging block then became a very basic source of compromise for a lot of different worms that we'll talk about, a few of those in a minute. And basically that protocol is handling file shares. It's handling all kinds of stuff. So if I could either crack SMB somehow, and guess what? It has some exploits in it. If I can guess your login, and I can get into the system, I can probably push something onto your system just like the Morris worm was trying to do, and then I can, of course, turn around and start to infect other systems. Now, network segmentation means it's harder for these things to spread. So if we actually egress filter, which is something we've talked about on this show before, you are going to block a lot of worm spreading type traffic. And we started learning these lessons the hard way all the way back. A worm's called Slammer, and I'm not trying to give you an exhaustive list of worms. If you want that, you can Google it, and you'll find massive lists of all these different worms that have run. These are ones that I dealt with. Slammer was in 2003. It was teeny. It was 376 bytes, literally. That's small. It fit in a single packet, so it spread really, really fast. It spread really, really easily. Everybody was connected to hubs, so all of a sudden the Slammer worm could jump in there. It could spread all over the place. It went around the world in minutes. It was basically an exploit in SQL Server, and it created a buffer overflow. I mean, this is efficient code, 376 bytes used to do a buffer overflow, exploit SQL Server, and get basically executable privileges. There was a patch when this worm came out, but a lot of people had not put the patch in place. Either their patching protocols were not very good or they were very slow. A lot of companies that I talked to about Slammer worm were dealing with Slammer, and the problem they had was they had not patched because their patching procedure was really, really slow and tedious. Once you patched it, everything was fine. This worm went out looking for UDP. So it was using a non-connection protocol. So a lot of people weren't even monitoring UDP traffic in 2003. They thought nothing was ever going to run on UDP. UDP port 1434 was a Slammer worm. If it found that, it tried to exploit SQL Server because that's where SQL Server was listening, and it exploited that UDP port, and boom. If you weren't patched, you got infected, the worm started spreading. Mostly what it did was it just caused denial of service in your network. So this worm hits one machine, and all of a sudden it just starts blasting out traffic all over your network. And in 2003, that was a big issue. And these hubs were not able to withstand these kind of attacks. The hubs were crashing. People were having all kinds of problems. What I was encountering with this thing was a lot of infected machines. People had installed SQL Server on these Windows machines for some reason, and they were all getting infected, and they would start broadcasting like crazy, and our hubs and routers started to crash. So basically, this was a big problem. Basically, what was happening as well was OSPF and other dynamic routing protocols were in use, like RIP, and these routing protocols have to recompute. So every time one of these devices crashed and it came back up, all that OSPF routing information had to be re-updated. So if you've ever dealt with routing convergence, and you know that can take some time, especially in 2003 on older equipment, boom, every few minutes you've got a device going down, all your dynamic routing protocols have to recompute, and boom, you've got a big problem from the Slammer worm. Some other famous worms, and again, I want to tell you, I'm not trying to be exhaustive here. I'm not trying to say this. This was just worms that I dealt with. Code Red worm, NIMDA. So Code Red 2, and NIMDA were all worms that I dealt with. They all exploited Microsoft-based systems that were connected to the internet. So it was one of the first times I started seeing end-user devices getting compromised by a worm. And in fact, the first time I saw Code Red, somebody from IT at this institution called me and they said, "What in the hell is going on? Can you look at it?" And they sent me I was seeing weird traffic on my network, and we looked at it. And I said, "This is a worm." And the guy said, "What is a worm?" And I was like, "Let me explain." So then he got a lecture about like you're getting right now. Beast was in 2002. It was written in Delphi, which used to be called Pascal. Obviously, Slammer. Stuxnet, I did not actually deal with Stuxnet, but I was really, really interested in it because Stuxnet was a worm that was supposedly written by the powers that be, and it was spreading through centrifuges, and it caused actual physical damage. And one of the reasons I got so interested in Stuxnet was because I had for years been telling people I've never seen a piece of malware that could actually damage your hardware, that could physically damage hardware. And Stuxnet caused the worm part of it, just spread it. The payload part of it caused these centrifuges to over-rev until the motors burned up. And it was actually invoked against Iran. So we don't know exactly who did it, but somebody did, and they caused all these problems. Dooku was a very similar worm that was supposedly released by powers that be, but we don't know. But then everything changed. So one of the things that we see today is called ransomware. And can we talk? Have you ever had one of those days when your ransomware didn't seem so fresh? Yeah, well, in 2013, we saw the first thing that I really was just kind of floored by, CryptoLocker. And I had never even thought about this, which, you know, I often think about bad things and doing bad things. Even though I don't do the bad things, I just think about them. And I saw something I had not thought of doing, which was encrypting your device. I saw malware that tried to slow your system down. I saw malware that made leaves fall down the screen. I saw malware that did all kinds of weird things, that deleted your files and stuff. But I just never see anything that was quite so, I don't know, I won't say cool, something that was quite so like, wow, what a devastating idea. CryptoLocker was really, really awful. And it did something bad to end users, and for once, I was seeing malware that seemed to have a point beyond just mischief, and it actually seemed to be just a truly criminal action. We could certainly say that the initial instance of CryptoLocker was not a worm because it was primarily spread with infected emails, but very quickly it evolved into both automated email spreads, so they added malware to it that would reach into your address book and send copies of this email to everyone that was in your address book, and so forth. And there were tons of these kind of things around that had done these very similar things. Like Naked Wife was one of the ones that we saw that went into your address book, pulled out all the entries, and sent a copy of this email that said Naked Wife in the subject field. And, you know, apparently people were real interested in seeing, you know, your grandfather's naked wife. Yeah, don't think about that too much. But this thing was different. It infected the registry. You had to click on it, so it wasn't a truly automated worm-type attack. And then once it did that, it reached out to a server. It downloaded an RSA key, and it used that key to encrypt all your files that had certain extensions on it. Boom. And then, here's the kicker. It asked you to pay. So because it got the key from a server, it got a public key off of a server somewhere, that public key was used to encrypt all your files. It had doc extensions, XLS extensions, whatever they were at the time. They've changed some of those. PDF, anything that seemed of value to you was encrypted. You could pay. They let you have the opportunity to mail them money. And I was just so floored by this idea that somebody could pay money and you know, you would have to buy your way out of this jam. Now, I immediately thought, well, what if I send the money and they don't send the key and they just say send even more money? And, you know, how much money do you send? And there were a lot of those as well. So one of the first true worms then that we saw that I think was based on the worm idea and the ransomware idea was in 2017. One of the most devastating worms that went around the world was called WannaCry. And WannaCry was based on the Eternal Blue worm exploit that supposedly NSA got hacked by the shadow brokers and had all their cool malware tools stolen. Now, listen, Scully, maybe, just maybe, the NSA hacked themselves which would mean they didn't actually do anything. And they released these tools which contain even more subtle malware that we have yet to be able to figure out based on alien algorithms and alien genetic structures. And all that is slowly reporting back to a guy smoking Morley cigarettes. Morley cigarettes. A guy smoking Morley cigarettes in a back room somewhere. I'm just making that conspiracy up, but I mean, if you had something like that, maybe it affects the implant that's already in your brain. I don't know, Scully. Maybe you've already been hacked, and we aren't even watching this for real. We all live in the Matrix. But WannaCry and then subsequently Petya and other worms like that utilize this Eternal Blue approach, which basically had another piece of malware attached to it called Double Pulsar that actually exploited server message block. And by doing that, this worm was able to get in your machine. It then immediately started broadcasting to other machines in your network saying, hey, are you running server messaging block? And guess what? If you're running Windows, you probably were. And if you hadn't patched up, then that version of server messaging block was subject to this Eternal Blue compromise, and that spread the worm to other machines. The encryption part of it then kicked in. Again, same thing. They ask you for money. If you paid them, maybe they send you the key, and so on. Now, all these networks today are so much more sophisticated than the networks were back in 1988. But listen, today, the estimate, which I think is a low estimate, is that there may be as many as 50 billion with a B, that's million if you're from the UK, but 50 billion devices attached to the intraweb. So that drone swarm you have flying around your house to protect you from harm, guess what? It's connected. Cam on your house, connected. The cam on your phone, connected. The cam Ring doorbell, connected. We saw an article yesterday, and I read an article in The Guardian about that Alyssa and Sheila, our two favorite devices, are actually not only just listening to us, they're recording, and that they're keeping all that information all connected. So everything is all connected. It's all connected at the same time. But the good news is today we do segment our networks. So we have segmentation. So we use VLANs. You use VLANs, right? And you prevent VLAN skipping attacks? Yeah, you do. Well, you better. We use routers, we use firewalls, we use all these things. So we're trying to break our networks into smaller and smaller segments. If you're at home and you have lots and lots of devices, you have drone swarms, you have cams, you have everything, it's a good idea to VLAN these things into separate networks, because if you do that, that means that worm attacks that compromise something cannot spread from device to device to device so readily, we hope. What we need to be doing is we need to run pen tests. You need to bit better patching. So a lot of these worms were stopped by just the fact that you patched up. But if you have a patching process that takes 8 to 12 months to get put into place, well, guess what? You may be sitting there and there may be worms. So you need to be monitoring that. You need to be monitoring traffic. I did a couple of network responses where when I looked at their network logs, they called me and they said, we don't know what's going on. Our network's really slow. We paid all this money. What's wrong? I go look at the log and I go, look at this. And you could see something like Slammer Worm or Code Red. It was not actually causing any damage, but it was sitting there running all the time. They had so many machines that were infected with Slammer Worm that it was slowing down their networks. And they didn't even know it because they were not looking at it. They were not patching. They were not doing log monitoring because that one person who was in charge of IT had been told, yeah, make sure everything keeps working. So segmentation is going to help you, but you have to use it right. That means you have to use network segments instead of just dumping everything in one big network. You have to use firewalling in all directions. You can't just firewall at the border. You need to be firewalling internally. You need to be running anti-malware tools. You need to be running tools that look for malware in your network flows. And you say, oh, Doug, I'm not a giant enterprise. Well, you may pretty soon. You're at home going to have so many devices that you're going to look like an enterprise in 1988. 0 days are going to continue to occur. So you're going to keep seeing this. And if you're not going to be diligent about it, it's going to get you. And some of these things may be heinous. And my point with the ransomware was not so much to worry about ransomware, although you should, and make sure you got offline backups and all that kind of stuff. In fact, right after I made this, I made another offline backup of all my stuff and put it up in a nice, safe place so that nobody could get it. Look, if I can hack you, I could write a new worm that takes advantage of a 0 day. boom, I got you. If I can take over that drone swarm at your house and turn it against you, wow, that would be really, really bad. I may even be able to hack humans, and that's called phishing, right? So if I can hack you, I can create a kind of not real worm, but it's a kind of worm. I get you to spread my malware for me. That's another kind of take. So what do you need to do? Patch. Keep up with your patches and monitor stuff like the radar page so that you know when stuff is going on. I see that constantly. People don't keep up. They're busy. They don't watch, and then they go, oh, I didn't even know about this thing. It's been out for 7 months, and there was a patch made 3 months ago. We didn't put it in place. You need to secure stuff. You need to think about segmentation and how you're going to do that, and you need to monitor and review and practice. None of these techniques works if you don't practice them. And until you do all those things, and even maybe if you do, there's always going to be worms that are going to come about. Worms are really hard to deal with. They're so fast. They spread so quickly. While you're asleep, the thing's going to jump out. You look at books like Snow Crash, a worm that spreads to your brain through your optic nerve, or maybe it was your auditory nerve. I think it was your auditory nerve in Snow Crash. Read The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. Don't watch the movie. Read the book. And in that one, even, there was a virus spreading from the aliens that killed them all. It's kind of lame, but, he wrote that in the 19th century, so what are you going to do? So, thanks for joining us today. Sorry you're sick, Russ. We had fun talking about worms. We'll be back next time. Hopefully Russ will be well by then, and we'll see you then on Secure Digital Life.